All right, so USDA has said they're going to take a peek at the product of the USA label. And that's been in the news some. If you heard that and you're a rational thinking human being, you probably thought, what's there to take a look at? If something was raised in the US and butchered in the US, then it's a product of the USA. And what you have to remember is in the cattle industry or the beef industry, you have to take all rational thought and throw it out the window because it doesn't apply. What actually gets labeled product of the USA when it comes to beef and pork is anything that's been packaged in a US packing plant or USDA inspected packing plant. And so what happens is all these imports come from 42 different countries, is what I counted up, from around the world, and they get sent into, you get your cuts of meat or your processed, or they mix up ground beef in those packing plants and then package it up, and it gets a product of the USA label on it. And so what that is actually is that process I just described is the definition of fraud. Fraud is when you take something and you put a label on it that's untrue and you try to increase the value of it and sell it. It's pretty much just straight up lying to the consumer. And that's what's going on with the product USA labels in the beef industry. And it got repealed in 2015. Before then, it was called mandatory country of origin, MCOOL, if you've heard that, and everything had to have a mandatory country of origin label on it, and the USDA loves it. USDA, if you go down, I'm going to put a link to the article where I'll have this video and then the USDA video where they show how cool it is, where you can go into a grocery store and pick up a piece of fruit and see exactly what country it came from. But then they also say, except for beef and pork, we don't do that for them. And so why is this happening? Like, why is it beef and pork, and why is this allowed? Why is the fraud allowed? And the answer to that would be the same as, like I always say in these videos, there's 4 major beef packing corporations, and 2 of them are Brazilian owned. JBS is headquartered in Brazil. National Beef is, the majority is owned by Marfrig, which is another meat packer out of Brazil. And so those 2 corporations, along with 2 others, control 85% of all the beef in the U.S. And they like to be able to import the beef coming from their home countries and package it in their packing plants over here and market product of the USA. Tyson and Cargill, I'm assuming, probably also like to buy this cheap imported meat and package it in their packing plants and market product of the USA. And so if you go back to like my videos I did where I kind of explained, I broke it down real simply and said, if you're not in a competitive marketplace, would you rather butcher 2 cattle a day for $400, or would you rather butcher 1 for $1,000? Less work for more money, you're going to do the 1. But if you want to add to that the imports, would you rather butcher 1 and also import a lot of cheap meat that you can mark the price up because you control the supply of, and you can market all product to the USA, and then you don't have to buy as many US cattle? Obviously that's what's happening. So Mackenzie Johnston does a Facebook video every day, or most days, where she gives updates on the cattle industry. And a few days ago she said something that caught my attention. She quoted a news report. In the first 5 months of this year, Brazilian beef imports rose 165%. In May, which is back when I started posting these videos and going into this beef market, cattle market crisis, Brazilian beef imports rose 186%, and that's when cattle market tanked and the beef prices in the grocery store went through the roof. So they were bringing in, so they decided they quit buying cattle from the U.S. and brought in more Brazilian beef than they ever had before, and increased retail prices because they're crooks. And so what a lot of people, I don't get back with the comments very often on here, but I do read them, and a lot of them are always like, why don't you just sell direct? Why don't you just sell direct consumer? And it's not as easy as that. And a lot of people are trying, and it's great to buy direct from your local rancher. But there's a lot of logistics involved, and the people who are making their living from the cattle industry or raising cattle are dealing with hundreds to thousands of heads of cattle. And so they can't just say, they can't just put a sign in their yard that says beef for sale and all of a sudden watch the money rolling in. They can't say, well, this year instead of selling our cattle, we're just going to take them all to locker and we'll be rich. It doesn't really work like that. There's a lot involved, and it's really a slow transition if you're going to do it. And so a lot of people are doing it. But to go back to the imports, I did it in 2005. I was selling direct on my family's beef, and I quit because it was just so much. There's so much that goes into it. And back then, it was hard to find customers, and it was just different 15 years ago. And so now a lot of people are doing it, and they're doing a good job with it. But one of the things you have to deal with, and I had to deal with back then, is finding a USDA inspected locker. If you want to sell nationally and you want to ship it across state lines, for most states now, it has to be in a USDA inspected locker, which is kind of ridiculous because if you want to import beef, so to USDA inspected locker, you have to have a USDA inspector there the whole time anything's being butchered. But if you want to import beef and import it into the U.S., the only thing you have to do is have a USDA approve your facility, and not all of your facilities, just one of your facilities. So the USDA, and they actually inspect every 2 to 3 years. They go and inspect these beef packing plants that are importing tons of beef into the U.S. And so if you want to start a locker here in the U.S., you have to pay for that inspector to be there all the time. But if you want to start a locker in Brazil and import your beef into the U.S. and only buy Brazilian cattle and only increase the Brazilian cattle price or affect that market, you just have to have a USDA inspector show up and say, okay. And then the next time he comes back is 2 to 3 years later. He tells you when he's coming so you can have everything all cleaned up and nice and neat for him to show up. And then he says, okay. And then he goes back home and you do it however you want to do it. And that's where they're killing the cattle and doing all the butchering. And then they're shipping it over. And so that is just a great example, really a perfect example of how the people who take the most risk in the whole industry, people who do the most work are the ones who get crapped on the absolute most and see the least amount of money out of this whole deal. And it's just a little guy over and over. They just can't catch a break. And so now, hopefully, the USDA says they're going to look into it. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to have faith in the government, but it's good. It's really, really good for them to even be bringing it up. But the only thing is, USDA can't do anything. They can't institute mandatory country of origin labeling. From the people I've talked to, the only way to institute that would be it has to go through Congress, which if USDA, I suppose, spends enough time and really gets into it, hopefully they can get mandatory country of origin back to where cattle producers now can have their own label from their own country on their beef, and they don't have to go to the grocery store and see their beef right next to the Brazilian beef, and both of them with the exact same labels on it.